Hello, my name is Peter Krause. I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston College and a research affiliate in the MIT Security Studies program. Welcome to Understanding Different Perspectives on International Relations in the Middle East and North Africa. This is a four-talk series here with the MIT Center for International Studies and the MIT Middle East and North Africa program. I'm honored to be invited to engage in these four sessions. The first one today is focused on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa under Trump. Now, this is a slimmed-down version of the event that we had yesterday. I decided to record one without all of the questions, so for those of you who could not attend, could have kind of a more focused, shorter version of my presentation. But I do look forward to hopefully having you at future talks. So this one is for, again, the first session, which was recorded on September 29th. We subsequently have one on October 27th on U.S. Gaza and the future for Palestinians, on November 24th, past, present, and future of Iran-Israel relations, and on December 8th, looking particularly at the Abraham Accords and Arab-Israeli relations. So all of these will be live sessions on Zoom. In terms of the session today, it's a similar setup of multiple different sections to the talk, but I stop at multiple times throughout the talk to do extensive Q&A with the audience. So if you would like to attend live, you can register by going to the QR code here or going to the MIT-MENA website. And then I will happily engage with you via Zoom webinar, and then there will be recordings like this for you or others who are not able to attend or want to watch thereafter. So just to give you a little background on me, I'm excited to be back with many of you who have been at my talks previously at MIT. But if you don't know, I'm someone who did my PhD at MIT in political science. I wrote my dissertation and first book on a topic related to today and this entire speaker series. So the title is this one in the bottom in the left, Rebel Power, Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win. It focused on the Zionist movement and the Palestinian national movement. I did hundreds of interviews with members of each movement, living for a number of years in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Beirut, Amman. I looked at why those movements during various periods were more or less successful at achieving their goal of an independent state, as well as why those movements at various points use violence or nonviolence to achieve their objective. I've also been a co-editor of a couple different volumes. One that's pictured here is called Coercion, The Power to Hurt in International Politics. That was co-edited along with Kelly Greenhill, an excellent professor from up the road at Tufts. This looked at the use and threat of force in international politics to kind of get other actors to do what you want. And then also, as pictured here, I spent a lot of my time in the summers working for two different organizations that focus on Israeli-Palestinian person-to-person peace building. So I lead the academic programming and some of the facilitation for MEET and for Our Generation Speaks, which involves a number of different 20 and 30-something Israeli and Palestinians who are very proud Israelis and Palestinians, but also want to learn and engage with people across the border to understand their hopes, their fears, their ways of engaging. So hopefully in the future, their people can find a better way to live side by side in peace in some form, hopefully much better than the situation that we have today. So that's what I've been involved with over the summers. I've also been involved in Track 2 negotiations, and I'm currently writing a book that's actually called How to Have a Constructive Conversation on Israel and Palestine, both based on my own experience teaching classes on the topic at BC and MIT for almost a decade and a half now, as well as based on my facilitations and actually interviews with about 25 other Israelis and Palestinians who have led dialogues as well as been part of them. So that's a little bit about my background. Now, what am I going to focus on today? 4 different sections. First and foremost, Trump and U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East, which is, of course, kind of the overarching topic of today's talk. Then Trump and the ceasefire negotiations that are ongoing right now with the U.S., Israel, and Hamas. Thirdly, Trump focusing on the airstrikes on the nuclear program in Iran. So obviously something that happened earlier this summer, but there's still reverberations in the region today. The Operation Midnight Hammer that knocked out some of Iran's nuclear program. And then finally, Trump and Israel's strike in Qatar. So basically these strikes that were launched by Israel going after the Hamas leadership in Qatar that have had significant regional ramifications. So we'll talk about that as well. All right, so first, what is grand strategy? You know, this is a term that's used sometimes when I was getting trained at MIT in my PhD program. It's one you may see sometimes in the news. In a basic sense, it's how do you summarize your plan to kind of cause security for yourself as a state? So if you're the president of the US or any other country, and you look and say, okay, I've got a military I've got economic tools, I've got the State Department, I've got various political tools and otherwise. I want to combine them into a cohesive strategy to make my country and my people more safe and secure, more economically prosperous. That would be your grand strategy. Now, sometimes people ask, do states actually need a grand strategy? Maybe you can just take every single event kind of case-by-case basis, doesn't have to fit in some broad plan. The challenge with that is, it's kind of like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around. A lot of stuff that happens in the government requires long-term planning in terms of advocating the funds, in terms of in the military, actually building the platform, in terms of providing clarity to your allies on what your actual commitments are and having credibility in what they are, and then ultimately having multiple government institutions that have to coordinate on whatever that strategy is. So we certainly have had presidents like maybe like the Eisenhower Doctrine or others that have this kind of clear labeled strategy that to some degree have actual cohesion in how it's been executed, and other presidents that are a little bit more kind of case by case. But in a basic sense, we can think about the grand strategy of a president or administration as a way to understand the general thrust of their foreign policy, what their priorities are, and how they hope to execute them. Now, there's been an ongoing debate in U.S. circles on grand strategy, particularly on grand strategy in the Middle East, for decades now. And it's more than just a binary two-sided debate, but to kind of simplify things and the key lines of discussion, I want to present these two approaches. So on the one end, we have something called deep engagement, or another strategy that's called primacy, which are different in some contexts, but maybe similar in terms of wanting the United States to be pretty deeply involved and engaged in the broader Middle East, having forward military deployments, playing a key role in trade disputes and protection of oil and shipping routes, and playing a big role in things like trying to resolve the conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians or others. So what do these folks argue are kind of the key benefits of their approach? First and foremost, it's the idea that if the U.S. is there, they reassure allies. Whether it's the Saudis or the Israelis or the Egyptians or others, having the U.S. there reassures those allies that the U.S. will help protect them, deter enemies, and ultimately promote peace and stability in the region. Secondly, obviously the Middle East is a key area for oil, and there's tons of oil that gets shipped out of the region every day. In fact, many, many thousands and potentially even hundreds of thousands of tons. And the U.S. being there and having an aircraft carrier battle group deployed to the region and other assets helped to ensure that oil is able to be shipped out of the region peaceably, not being hijacked by pirates or facing ongoing conflict that clogs up shipping lanes or various straits. So that's point two. Point three, especially since 9/11, folks that support these types of grand strategies have said having forward deployment is what allows the United States to go after different terrorist or insurgent groups that may threaten either U.S. interests and allies in the region or even the U.S. homeland, right? They'll either point to things like planning for the 9/11 attack that happened in Afghanistan, or more directly, even if you want to do drone strikes, you still need to have bases in the region and soldiers there to kind of man them and take care of them. So these are some of the key points that are offered in terms of why people support this idea of deep engagement or primacy. Now, on the other side of the coin, and for a number of my mentors at MIT, they've supported this grand strategy called restraint. The argument here is that the United States is perhaps the safest great power we've had in modern history. The U.S. has the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to the east and west, which are maybe the greatest natural moats. We have generally favorable and non-threatening countries to the north and south, Canada and Mexico. And so the United States does not need to have this extensive forward military deployment, engagement in these forever wars that the U.S. rarely wins and that cost a lot in human lives as well as in economic costs and debt that is increasing for the United States. So that's point one. Point two, look, the number one producer of oil in the world today is actually the United States. And it doesn't mean that Saudi oil or Iranian oil or Kuwaiti oil isn't important, and in fact maybe less costly to extract than oil in other parts of the world. But Middle Eastern energy resources are losing some of their importance with fracking and with access to oil in other parts of the world. So the U.S. needing to be there to protect those oil lanes may be less important than previously we thought, and also the fact that, hey, it's not like these countries and others don't have an incentive to be able to ship their product out. So even if the U.S. isn't there, decently likely, at least the supporters of restraint argue, that shipping will still continue. And then finally, they would argue having U.S. foreign military occupations of countries in the region or even forward military deployment can lead to a lot of anti-Americanism and anti-U.S. opinion in the region. So for these reasons and more, some folks support this idea of restraint. One of the things you want to think about yourself is just to say, hey, where do I fall on the spectrum? Am I someone who thinks the U.S. should be very deeply engaged in the Middle East because it's got a lot of positives for the U.S. and maybe even the peoples of the region? Do you think the opposite, the U.S. should be pulling back significantly from the region for its own interests and maybe the interests of the people there? Or are you kind of somewhere in the middle along the spectrum? Important to think about that. Now, when we think about recent presidents and presidential candidates, there's been a decent concentration over kind of the left of this spectrum. And to be clear, left and right here is not a partisan thing. As you can see, the late Senator John McCain, who was the Republican nominee for president at one point, argued the U.S. should remain deeply engaged in the Middle East, along with people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and to some extent Barack Obama. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people like Republican presidential candidate, though not nominee, Rand Paul, who has strongly argued for the idea of restraint. And again, some people are a little bit more in the middle. I put Obama there on the side towards deep engagement, but someone who certainly strongly critiqued the war in Iraq and pulled U.S. troops significantly out of Iraq. And then I have a question mark over Trump, which again is the focus of today, because he has said and done things that kind of fit to some extent in each category. On the one hand, he's done things like striking Iran and Iran's nuclear program with a major U.S. airstrike, which prior presidents have not done, which would fit more in the realm of kind of primacy or a more quote-unquote like muscular, U.S. foreign policy. But then also, he's someone who signed the deal to get the U.S. out of Afghanistan, has spoken against having troops in Syria, has talked about pulling back from the region. And so in a broad sense, he's also had inclinations towards restraint. Now, when we actually look at Trump's grand strategy, there's a number of different characteristics I think we can say with confidence are part of it. So first, many people have described his approach as transactional. You get something, I get something, and seeing himself, as I note here, as a big deal maker. Some people would say, look, being transactional is kind of the opposite of being strategic, and there's some truth to that, right? A grand strategy is something where you have this cohesive vision and you fit your various actions inside of it, whereas Trump to some extent has been a bit more transactional here or there. Yes, you can see some of it fitting into some broader vision or plan or set of values, but some of it is certainly transactional and maybe a bit ad hoc. Secondly, I would say Trump certainly has a desire for wins, whether it's political wins or kind of personal wins. He certainly touts himself as a major peacemaker, and I think one of the motivations he has to try to bring peace to either the Israelis and Palestinians or the broader region is to kind of have that win, which, again, one can understand, I guess. Thirdly, talks about the idea of willingly using significant economic and military power to both coerce allies and enemies. So significantly defunded the State Department and public diplomacy, not a fan of quote-unquote soft power or kind of the power of attraction, instead believes strongly in whether it's tariffs, whether it's threats of military force, that's the way you get leverage and that's the way you pressure people to do what you want them to do. And so whether it has been, allies in Europe or to some extent in the Middle East or enemies like Iran, Trump has used significant economic and military force, or at least the threats of that force, to try to coerce outcomes. Fourthly, Trump certainly does not see himself as being bound by international norms and institutions, instead focuses on the leverage that each party has, the interest that he believes the United States and he have in terms of dictating how he's actually going to act on the international stage. He's also significantly questioned the value of particular alliances, including NATO, as well as some of the other connections that we've had in the Middle East, the United States has had in the Middle East, and has pushed for some extent economic nationalism and kind of a rebuilding of American manufacturing and less reliance on foreign trade. And then finally, I will say that even though we can talk about Trump's grand strategy, being more here and more there, and these particular parts of it, it's important to note that if you look inside his administration, one of the reasons there's a question mark over him, and I've seen, people I respect greatly who say, no, he's a restrainer, no, he's not, is because he has people inside of his administration that are all along this spectrum. He has people who want the U.S. to be very involved in the Middle East, very actively and aggressively supportive of, say, Israel, and others who are much more pushing for the U.S. to pull back from the region, not just from support potentially for the Israelis, but also potential support just in the region writ large, forward deployment of U.S. troops, etc. Okay, so let's move from these talks about general grand strategy to talking more particularly about the ongoing ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas that the Trump administration has now significantly inserted itself into. So first, as a reminder, there was a ceasefire earlier this year that was signed with pressure from the Trump administration. It had 3 phases, as you can see here. We got to and through phase 1, in which basically 36 or so Israeli hostages were exchanged for a larger number of Palestinian prisoners. There was a stopping in general of violence. There was an influx of aid into Gaza for the Palestinians there. But we never got to phase 2, in which there was going to be more exchange of prisoners and release ultimately of hostages, as well as beginnings of Israeli withdrawal kind of from the region in certain areas, and then ultimately full withdrawal coming in phase 3, which we've never gotten to at all. So there was previously this phase discussion of the different pieces that each side wants, but for reasons we'll discuss, Netanyahu and Hamas had their own incentives to not necessarily go along the different phases of this agreed upon deal. Now let's look at Netanyahu first. On the one hand, he has this belief that when the war ends, potentially bad things can happen for him and his governing coalition. So in political science terms, we often use this terminology of gambling for resurrection, the idea that when someone's in kind of a realm of loss or things aren't going so well, they have some incentive to take some risky actions to try to win it all back or even do better than they were before. For Netanyahu, this is basically post-October 7th. A number of Israelis blame Netanyahu for not being able to prevent the October 7th attacks. I think the percentage of Israelis who trusted him in the days after was under 10%. But since the past 2 years have occurred with things like the Beeper operation with Hezbollah or airstrikes against Iran or against the Houthis or against Hamas, Netanyahu, as you saw maybe in his UN speech, has claimed a number of wins, at least from a military perspective. And so he feels like he's doing better than he was on October 8th, 2023, and when the war ends, a number of negative things are going to potentially happen. First and foremost, he has some far-right allies like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who have said under certain circumstances they would actually leave his coalition if Netanyahu agreed to end the war without destroying Hamas or with agreeing to withdraw from Gaza. Secondly, in Israel, there's supposed to generally be something called a State Commission of Inquiry, which actually investigates when there's a calamity like October 7th or previously like the Yom Kippur War in 1973, investigates how this happened, who's responsible for it, etc. This will certainly investigate Netanyahu's role. He's been able to part off, even though there have been investigations inside of Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military, but there hasn't been one for the Israeli political establishment like him, because he said this can't happen while the war is going on. Once the war ends, it very likely will happen. Thirdly, he has ongoing corruption trials that he's been able to kind of slow play and delay because of the ongoing conflict. Those will quicken if and when the war ends. And then finally, Israel has prevented a number of international journalists from going into Gaza, even though we have seen pictures from Palestinian journalists or things from camera phones from individuals. There will still be a broader accounting of the situation in Gaza with an influx of international media if and when the conflict ends. And to be honest, some of that probably will not go Israel's way in terms of the war of images, and I think Netanyahu knows this. Now, what does he gain by continuing the conflict? First and foremost, he's certainly not blind to the fact that Israel is more economically, diplomatically, and politically isolated than has been for quite a long time, if ever. So he looks around and says, look, if the war is going to go on for another month or 3 months, is all of a sudden the world going to say, oh my goodness, the Israelis were really supportive of you, we take back the criticism we had before? I think if he's thinking this way, he recognizes, no, that's probably not going to change. And so Israel is already significantly castigated for its conduct in Gaza. So from his perspective, what's another week or a month or a year, especially if he feels like in that time, IDF is going to be able to degrade Hamas further. He's going to be able to try to cement his legacy with other wins on the battlefield. So ultimately, this is one of the incentives for why he may want to continue things. And to be honest, if you go back to talks from me or others 2 years ago after October 7th, this is something we predicted may be the case. Secondly, he does think, not necessarily incorrectly, that at least on the battlefield, Israel is much more powerful than Hamas and some of the other groups that it's engaging with. And so in terms of just a pure military context, there's going to be more destruction to Hamas and potentially to the broader Gaza and West Bank regions, which again can be part of what some of his coalition wants to achieve the longer this goes on. Thirdly, he wants to stay in power like any politician does, and he's the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history for a reason. He has pledged from October 7th onwards that Israel would have a total victory. And total victory means either just the full destruction of Hamas or basically the destruction of Hamas as any real significant political force in Gaza or potentially elsewhere. If the war ends today, that hasn't exactly happened. So he is then vulnerable to those to his right who would critique him for kind of giving up before he achieved what he said he was going to do. And so again, he has some incentives to kind of keep the conflict going, especially since he thinks Israel and he may be doing better in this case than they may do if it ends now with a ceasefire. Now, let's turn to Hamas. Hamas leadership has also said things along the lines of like, time is on our side, right? Here's a quote from Osama Hamdan saying, quote, "Time is not on Israel's side due to the current international pressure and mood." So for Hamas, they look at the number of countries that have been critiquing Israel or labeling the situation in Gaza as a genocide or recognizing a Palestinian state, or looking at the polls in terms of how people are feeling, whether they're more supportive of the Israelis or more supportive of the Palestinians. And Hamas looks at this and says, this is a sea change in terms of international public opinion, and the longer this goes on and Israel keeps doing what it's doing in Gaza, the more the Palestinian cause is on the map and the more support it gets. Now, of course, Hamas has to recognize the massive humanitarian cost in Gaza, and they've certainly taken criticism from inside the Arab world and including Palestinians in Gaza for their seeming indifference to this. But in a broad sense, for them as an organization and maybe their belief in the Palestinian cause, they think time is on their side. It's also important to note, kind of like Netanyahu, if and when a ceasefire is agreed to, they are pretty quickly going to need to give up their main piece of leverage over Israel, which is the remaining hostages, both living and dead. So once they give up those hostages, all bets are off to some extent. Even if there's an agreement on paper that Israel will withdraw or not attack Hamas or whatever, Hamas now has to believe in Israel's good graces they won't do so because, again, the international system does not have a world government to enforce this stuff. Will Trump hold Netanyahu's feet to the fire? Maybe, but maybe not. And so Hamas is very wary of giving up the last hostage because it knows at that point it could become open season even more on Hamas with really nothing to bargain from their end. A couple of other points. It's not just Israel and the U.S. and even the Europeans that are pushing for Hamas to disarm. The Saudis and other Arab states in the New York Declaration have also said Hamas needs to disarm, as has the Palestinian Authority. So if and when the conflict ends, Hamas will no longer be running Gaza. Hamas will be pushed to disarm and basically potentially leave Gaza as any type of real entity. And then also, it faces an internal reckoning. There certainly are still Palestinians who are supporters of Hamas, or at the very least are supporters of the October 7th attacks, which they see as a response to a number of Israeli actions before. But there are also a lot of Palestinians who are not supportive of Hamas and or blame them for a lot of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza today. Not as much, certainly, as they blame the Israelis, but they see Hamas as being at least partially culpable as well. So Hamas is going to face some of that reckoning if and when this conflict ends. Now, in the background to some of these prior negotiations, you have some interesting interviews that came out. So Matthew Miller, you may remember, in the Biden administration, used to give interviews as part of the State Department or otherwise, talking about negotiations and talking about how Hamas was preventing them, etc. He came out recently in an interview with an Israeli television network saying that actually Netanyahu himself was sabotaging a lot of deals, but he and the U.S. never said so publicly because that would have actually helped Hamas and made it seem like there was daylight between the U.S. and the Israelis, or make Hamas feel like, kind of, again, time is on their side here. But he said at even various points the Biden administration would announce a ceasefire without even having fully talked about it with Netanyahu to kind of box Netanyahu in so he would then agree to it, because previously when they would get Netanyahu to agree to something behind the scenes, Netanyahu would then change and say, oh, this is a partial deal, I want a total deal, or vice versa, or he would add new requirements regarding the Philadelphia corridor or otherwise. And so ultimately, this led to the fact that, again, Netanyahu has some incentives, at least at that time, and I think even today, to not necessarily end the conflict at that point. Now, that being said, the Israeli military talked in the days after October 7th about a, quote, window of legitimacy, right? Basically, how long Israel would have as a window before internationally from the U.S. or others, the Israelis would be pressured to kind of stop their invasion of Gaza and their attacks on Hamas. For the most part, I think that window has closed. Pretty much Netanyahu is just down to Trump as kind of the last remaining external actor who is willing to support potentially the ongoing invasion of Gaza by the Israelis. Now, I say potentially because Trump has now said it's time to end, I think we're close to a deal, etc. But again, depending on how these negotiations go, Netanyahu may still have a little more time. We'll see. Now, you may have seen in the news stuff about the Trump 21-point plan, which, again, has just become a 20-point plan, which I'll talk about. I don't want to go through all of these, but I want to give you a little annotation on some of these points, and again, which ones in particular might be sticking points between Israelis, Hamas, U.S., European, Arab states, etc. Okay, so starts with some key things for the Israelis. Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to his neighbors. Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of its people. If Israel and Hamas agree to the proposal, the war will end. IDF will halt all operations in Gaza and gradually withdraw. Within 48 hours, I think it's now 72, all hostages will be returned. So those first two parts are trying to reassure the Israelis that Gaza is not going to be a threat. The fourth one in particular, all of the hostages return within like a 2 or 3 day period. And then the main thing that Hamas will be looking for and the Palestinians will be looking for, the war will end, the IDF will halt operations, and then gradually withdraw from the Strip. So that's the most basic and important part of the deal that each side to varying degrees needs. That being said, there's already some key issues there in terms of like which of those things happened first, or can we believe the other side is going to hold up their end of the bargain? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Israel will free several hundred Palestinian prisoners and over 1,000 Gazans who have been arrested since the conflict started after October 7th. Once the hostages are returned, Hamas members who commit to peaceful coexistence can be granted amnesty and leave the Strip. So again, interesting possibility. Aid will surge into the Strip. So again, recognizing the humanitarian crisis for Gazans, there will be a surge of aid. Where things get a little bit dicier in a grayer area is on point 8. Who's actually going to distribute the aid? This says United Nations and the Red Crescent. Does that mean UNRWA is going to be a distributor of aid? That certainly would not be something that the Netanyahu or probably Trump administration would support. But it's listed there, so we'd have to see. It also says other international organizations. That opens the door to this kind of Israel and U.S.-backed aid organizations that's had a lot of issues distributing aid and honestly has committed some violent acts against Palestinians while doing so. So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on, who would distribute the aid under this plan. This is the other like key sticking point listed so far, which is who's going to administer Gaza after this ceasefire is signed and goes into effect. So this has already undergone some revisions. This talks about government of Palestinian technocrats in consultation with an international body with Arab and European partners. Also, the Palestinian Authority will be part of it once it's completed its reform. The most recent version of this also now has a quote-unquote board of peace, which President Trump will head. So again, these are all the various players that have a stake and a desire to kind of control Gaza, except for Hamas. The issue really, for me, comes down to like, this is so many different actors that are going to supposedly have a hand in kind of running things on the ground. This doesn't even mention, by the way, the fact that potentially Tony Blair is going to be one of the key leaders on the ground in Gaza. So figuring out who actually has authority when people disagree, and trust me, they're all going to disagree, who actually gets to control and say what are these reforms the PA has to undergo, when have they met them, at what point did they get authority turned over to them. Again, that's why this is not an agreement. This is kind of the basics or the bones of a potential agreement. If this is going to get instituted at all, it's going to be weeks or months of hashing it out among these actors in terms of what's this actually going to look like, and that hashing out would continue after this ceasefire is actually agreed to in terms of its actual practice. A couple of other things. This is important certainly for the Palestinians and for Hamas. No one will be forced to leave Gaza, but those who choose to leave will be allowed to return. So this is obviously a key concern, especially since you have some Israeli ministers talking about literally expelling Palestinians from Gaza or, having them voluntarily migrate from the region. So this very clearly says that will not happen. At the same time, going back for a concession for the Israelis, Hamas will have no role in the governance whatsoever. They'll be committed to peaceful coexistence, whoever's ruling Gaza thereafter, destruction of tunnels in Gaza, and disarming of Hamas. And then kind of the final couple of points, talking about kind of normalization between Arab states and the Israelis, talking about establishing a dialogue to agree on a broader peaceful coexistence, so kind of nudging towards the idea of a two-state solution or Palestinian statehood. And then a couple of other things that stick out here. One, if Hamas delays or rejects the proposal, then these things will continue in the quote-unquote terror-free areas. But actually, after the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, Trump's kind of come out and said, or Netanyahu's also confirmed, that if Hamas doesn't agree to this, that Trump will give Netanyahu and the Israelis the green light to continue their operations in Gaza City. The one that to me stuck out like a kind of a green thumb here from the beginning was Israel agrees not to carry out future strikes in Qatar. The U.S. and the international community acknowledge Doha's important mediating role in the conflict. So it just kind of sticks out because it seems kind of plucked in there amidst all this other stuff regarding Gaza. It, of course, is part of the fact, as we'll talk about later, of Israel's strike on Hamas and Qatar and the significant anger by the Qataris and others in the region. This was actually removed in the most recent version, so that's why it's now a 20-point plan instead of a 21-point plan. But it's important because it gets to the idea that, again, this is not just an actors and stakes between the Israelis and Hamas. It also involves Arab states like Qatar who have acted as mediators and the United States. I mentioned a bunch of these before, but just to summarize, what to me are the key sticking points in any potential ceasefire deal, whether this Trump version or others. Sequencing of events, it's not just what each side gets, it's who has to go first or when these things get rolled out. Secondly, do you believe that Hamas would actually agree to give up all of its arms? And if not, who is actually going to disarm them and enforce that disarmament? That's a key sticking point and question mark. The future governance and who rules Gaza the day after, especially if it's an amalgamation of like 5 different actors. To me, a lot of problems there in terms of how that actually gets carried out. Fourthly, borders, particularly the Philadelphia corridor, the border between Gaza and Egypt. The Netanyahu administration has been very strongly saying at multiple points that they want to hold on to that border. It's the only border they did not control. They previously controlled the 2 land borders between Israel and Gaza, as well as the Navy stationed off the coast. But they say they want to maintain the Philadelphia corridor so they can have 360-degree control of Gaza. We'll see whether that would happen or not in any deal. And then again, as I mentioned, the aid, who distributes it, when it comes in, etc. So in terms of the Trump-Netanyahu meeting that happened on Monday in the White House, I have no doubt behind the scenes that Netanyahu is pushing Trump to revise the plan in a couple of ways, minimize, if not eliminate, the role of the Palestinian Authority, reject any mention or pathway towards a Palestinian state, allow more time for an IDF offensive or control on Gaza in terms of any withdrawal, and even potentially facilitate or allow the emigration or removal of Gazans. So some of these came into subsequent versions of the plan, others still might, but this is certainly some of the stuff that's being pushed behind the scenes by Netanyahu and his allies with the Trump administration. Now, it's important to note, it's not just these 2 individuals, of course, that are negotiating. It's Hamas, as we've talked about, but also the various publics. So let's start with the American public, which is obviously the one that President Trump is, elected to serve. This is one of a wave of fascinating polls that have come out by Quinnipiac, by the New York Times, by a bunch of them, all saying, versions of the same thing, which is, from what you know about the situation in the Middle East, do your sympathies lie more with the Israelis or more with the Palestinians? And you get almost a dead heat. In fact, in this case, 1 more percentage point, 37% of Americans saying more sympathetic with the Palestinians, 36% saying more with the Israelis. Now, you might say, that's pretty even. That's a sea change. As was said here, this is the highest percentage for the Palestinians and the lowest for the Israelis since this poll was done in 2001. New York Times, I think, said something similar with their poll going back to maybe 1988. So there has been this surge in sympathy and support for the Palestinians and a decrease for the Israelis, and we're seeing it in the polls today. Now, you may look and say, okay, let's look at the Democrats. Wow, 5-1 almost, or about support or sympathy for Palestinians versus Israelis, and then almost the reverse for Republicans. It's like, okay, so Trump's coalition is generally more sympathetic with the Israelis. True, but yes, on the Democratic side, you've seen this surge where you have more and more Democrats who are supportive or sympathetic with the Palestinians, but there is growing splintering in the MAGA coalition for Trump. So first, it is correct to say, as opposed to like allies in Europe or elsewhere, Trump has treated Israel with much kind of a softer touch. It's really the one ally that Trump has not in any significant way threatened economically or politically or otherwise. And I think some of that is because of his personal connection or support to Israel, trying to satisfy some of his major supporters back home and his coalition who thinks very positively of the Israelis. But it's important to note it's not a unanimous support, not just even among Republicans, but among the MAGA coalition. So when we think about this stuff, there are a number who say, okay, America first. That actually means not having so much foreign aid, and the number 1 recipient of foreign aid is Israel. So that would mean cutting aid to Israel. It's also the fact that in a poll that was done recently, 73% of MAGA Republicans said when they were given a choice, do you want the U.S. to spend more money on peace-building initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians or weapons for Israel? You had more, even of Trump supporters, saying peace-building initiatives. This carried over. Now, to be clear, again, there's folks on both sides of this within Trump's world. So the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, had this conference, 50 States One Israel, where he brought over, I think it was about 250 U.S. politicians, members of Congress. He gave a very stout defense of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, calling Israel like, America's wife of sorts, saying that you should be protecting or supporting, your spouse in times of need. He even compared Israel to America's, quote, 436th congressional district. So someone who is very much on the side of like engagement, support with the Israelis, not pulling back one iota, if anything, giving even more economic and political support to Israel. On the other hand, you have folks like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene or commentator Tucker Carlson who say U.S. aid to Israel should end, maybe even if Israel stops its operation in Gaza, but certainly if it continues. Marjorie Taylor Greene used the term genocide to refer to Israel's actions and has continued to do so in Gaza. So you see some splintering there. And then we had the killing of Charlie Kirk, who is obviously a major figure on the right and kind of in the broader MAGA coalition. There was a very weird thing that happened, which is there's this online conspiracy theory that Israel actually ordered or responsible for killing Charlie Kirk. I don't have any evidence to that. I don't think that's true at all. But it got to the point that Netanyahu, again, this looks like a fake thing. It's actually a real thing. He did this major speech that was recorded and broadcast online saying that Israel did not kill Charlie Kirk. Now, you might think this is just like internet stuff kind of run amok, but there's something real and important behind it, which is in some of the later days of Charlie Kirk's life, there was a growing feeling among some of his supporters and others that he was questioning or criticizing Netanyahu or full U.S. support for the Israelis. And so Netanyahu realizes that Kirk and his supporters are a key part of the support for Israel inside the United States. So he's trying to kind of quell that with this type of speech and praising Kirk, etc. But long and short, this shows some of the fracturing that's happening even in the right inside the United States in terms of support for Israel. Okay. Third topic, let's talk about U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear program. So going back and rewinding back to the last time Trump was in office during his first term, he came to office saying that the nuclear deal that was signed under the Obama administration was, quote, like the worst deal that's ever been had in the entire history of the world. He subsequently pulled the U.S. out of that agreement. Even though the Biden administration tried to not rejoin it fully, but have another version of it, that never happened. So the U.S. is not currently party to this deal, even though some Europeans to some extent still are. But long and short, in the aftermath of October 7th and Israel's striking of Hezbollah and Hamas and other parts of the quote-unquote Iran axis of resistance, the Israelis also did major bombing campaigns against Iranian facilities, against anti-aircraft, and then convinced Trump, I think behind the scenes, that the U.S. can now do this thing where they launch B-2 bombers with bunker busters, things that basically no other country in the world has, to knock out Iran's nuclear program, including its nuclear facilities at places like Fordo, which is basically buried under a mountain, and most weapons, including that of the Israelis, can't really penetrate. So ultimately, the U.S. did carry out this operation. It's one that Netanyahu himself has called for decades. I remember when I was in grad school, some of my colleagues wrote about the potential for a strike like this and whether it could actually succeed. There's still some uncertainty about how much this strike actually did succeed from a tactical level. It does seem like a lot of these facilities were destroyed to significant degrees, but whether the Iranians got some of the highly enriched uranium out of there before the strikes or whether some aspects of that was preserved afterwards, I think is quite an open question. It's also important to note, even though the Israelis for a long time have had a policy of going after and assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, and some others were probably killed in these strikes, Iran still has the know-how that's not going to go away in terms of how to build this weapon. They still probably have some highly enriched uranium up to the 60% level. Now, they may be newly deterred in terms of pursuing highly enriched uranium beyond that or rebuilding their ballistic missile arsenal, but in some broad sense, this was a strike that had not happened before, caused significant damage, but I don't think the Iranian nuclear program is gone, and whether it becomes a weaponized program, I think remains to be seen. Now, this strike itself also caused similar fractures inside the MAGA coalition. You had a number of folks who supported Trump's use of force in this case, but you can watch, again, this interesting interview, kind of extended podcast between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz over this, where folks like Cruz were saying, this is the right move, Iran is an enemy, like we need to prevent them from becoming a nuclear armed power, whereas Carlson's saying, look, this is the U.S. again, stepping its toe and getting into a potential forever war without any real understanding of the dynamics of the country that they're attacking, whether this is going to actually make Iran less or more likely to build a nuclear weapon. So you can see some of the debate inside there on kind of broader foreign policy and grand strategy discussion. Now, I mentioned axis of resistance. I just want to make sure I define that term for those who don't know. This is a key part of Iran's grand strategy. In fact, maybe the most important part of Iran's grand strategy in the region. Since the revolution in 78-79, and you have basically the Islamic government inside of Iran, they have tried to position themselves as not just the head of kind of Iran, but also the hegemon or dominant power in the broader region of the Gulf, as well as kind of the leader of the broader Muslim world, for which they tussle with the Saudis and the Egyptians to some extent and other states. So their key policy a lot of the time has been backing different political actors in other countries, whether it was Hezbollah in Lebanon, which they helped to kind of create, or the Assad regime in Syria, or groups like Hamas. They're to varying degrees funding, training, diplomatically supporting these actors to both kind of spread, quote unquote, their revolution, but also as a deterrent and a way to coerce the Israelis. So it's not a coincidence that after the October 7th attacks, Israel holds Iran partially responsible and then doesn't just go after Hamas, but also is going after Hezbollah, going after the Houthis, etc. To be fair, this was also Hamas's belief with October 7th. It's why they called the attacks the Al-Aqsa Flood. They did not think that they could defeat the Israelis directly on the battlefield, but they did think that their attack would provoke the Israelis and inspire Hezbollah, the Iranians, and others to then encircle Israel in a series of attacks that would then cripple the country. So again, both sides were thinking about this kind of axis of resistance and how to use it or how to respond to it. The final thing I'll note in the background of this is that just a day or two ago, the UN Security Council rejected these last-ditch efforts by the Russians and the Chinese to stave off snapback sanctions, and now snapback sanctions against Iran are scheduled to be put back on. And these are basically a series of sanctions that freeze Iranian assets, make it so they can't develop their ballistic missiles without penalty, make it so there's certain arms deals that can't happen. So this won't change much in terms of what the U.S. is doing, because the U.S. has pulled out of this, but it will change what some of the Europeans and others will do with Iran. And Iran right now, if you don't know, is having some of its greatest economic catastrophes in history. So this will hit the Iranians hard, who are already facing a lot of domestic problems, and we'll see what the fallout of that shall be. Okay, final section. Israel's strike in Qatar. So this is something that you may remember just happened a few weeks ago. There was this unannounced but then somewhat surprise strike where Israeli planes probably flew to the Red Sea and then launched these missiles going into Doha, the capital of Qatar, trying to kill leaders of Hamas that were actually gathering to discuss some ongoing ceasefire proposals. From a militarily and tactical perspective, this was generally a failure. Even though they did kill a few individuals, there weren't any major Hamas leaders that were killed. In fact, it was reported that some children of some of the Hamas leaders were killed, and actually a Qatari security officer was killed, which additionally angered the Qataris. This was important because this wasn't random. The Qataris had acted as this go-between between Hamas and Israel, not just since October 7th, but actually beforehand. The Qataris were providing funding to Gaza and to Hamas, actually with Israeli support and Netanyahu's support before October 7th. In terms of the motivations for this strike, Israel has long had a policy since October 7th of saying to Hamas, you're not safe anywhere. We hold you responsible for this attack that obviously you carried out. So whether you're in Gaza, whether you're here or there, we'll go after and we'll kill you. And in fact, the Israelis have done that in Syria and other places beforehand. But that being said, this was still somewhat of a shock because the Qataris are designated as a major non-NATO ally, which is, again, pretty high-ranking distinction regarding the U.S. They're the country that has the largest U.S. military base in the entire region. And again, at various points, they talked about potentially expelling the Hamas leadership, but they were encouraged by the Americans and to some extent the Israelis to actually keep them there, to continue to be this negotiator and mediator between them. So from the Qataris' perspective, they're like, what else can we do here? How could we be a target of this stuff when we're doing all of these things? They kind of felt like they were under the U.S. security umbrella to some extent. So the Qataris came out and said this was a criminal attack, flagrant violation of sovereignty and international law. They hosted this conference with all these other Arab leaders. The president of Egypt called Israel an enemy. Again, this is a country that has a peace treaty with the Israelis since 1978-79. It became kind of a diplomatic row with Trump and Netanyahu because Barak Ravid, who's a very plugged-in reporter on both the Israeli and American side, said that the Israelis told him that basically the Israelis notified the Trump administration like an hour or 50 minutes ahead of the strike that it was happening, which isn't that much time, but it's enough for Trump certainly to say, don't do it, or call the Qataris and let them know. Seems he did not do that, but he was very upset, and the Trump administration was very upset that the Israelis kind of said that. So the Israelis ultimately, they've changed the language now and have said things like, this was an Israeli decision. So not denying that they didn't say anything, but basically kind of putting all of the onus on the Israelis. The reason that's tough for Trump is because obviously Qatar's an ally. ally. In addition, for him, if you remember, the Qataris gave Trump a $1 billion plane early on in his administration. So he does not want to be seen as someone who's allowing or not stopping an attack on an ally like this. So the UN Security Council actually did a statement that condemned the attack. The US did not just not veto it, they actually supported it, which again, kind of a rebuke to the Israelis in that regard. Now, there's been things like this before, as I mentioned. The Israelis and Netanyahu launched a strike in Syria previously, going after some individuals there. This was some of the fallout then. So members of the Trump administration leaking quotes like, Bibi is the nickname for Netanyahu, acted like a madman. He bombs everything all the time. This could undermine what Trump is trying to do. Or saying like, the feeling is that every day there's something new. What the F? Or Netanyahu is sometimes like a child who just won't behave. So there was already frustration with Netanyahu back in July for some of the strikes in Syria. And then we get this, I think, destined to be maybe a famous or infamous picture in the region. This just came out today. This is the picture that the White House released. Again, this is not something that was just randomly taken. The White House purposely released this photo. This is a picture of Trump holding the phone as Netanyahu calls the leader of Qatar to apologize. Looks like maybe he's reading from a script in terms of the apology that potentially Trump is kind of making him do. Now, again, there's so many elements to this. This could be Trump trying to show, I'm the one in control. I'm upset about this strike. I'm making Netanyahu apologize. Sorry, Qataris, you know it wasn't me. It could also even be Netanyahu saying, I actually like this image because it shows to my allies back home that I'm being pushed to do this. I'm not doing this on my own free will because this won't play well with some of Netanyahu's coalition that he was apologizing to the Qataris. But in any case, you see some very interesting power dynamics with this photo. Regardless of the dynamics, there was a bunch of regional fallout. Soon after this attack happened, the Saudis proclaimed that they had signed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan. And if you don't know, Pakistan is the one majority Muslim country that has nuclear weapons, and that was not lost on the Saudis. In fact, it's seemingly part of the deal. So it's a little unclear, but it does seem like the Saudis may now be under a security or even nuclear umbrella from Pakistan. And again, the Saudis are a country that for a long time has relied on U.S. security and, preventing regime change or threats to the Saudi government. But they look around at the Qataris and they say, okay, the U.S. didn't prevent that attack. They look at Hosni Mubarak and how when the protests were happening inside of Egypt, the U.S. didn't prevent him from coming out of power. In fact, they kind of supported elections thereafter. And the Saudis and other monarchs especially are looking around and saying like, I don't know if when the chips are down, if we're going to be attacked externally or protested internally, if the Americans will be there to kind of save us or prevent us from falling. So you get things like this, and you get Egypt trying to renew this proposal for an Arab NATO that would actually exclude the Israelis and to some extent balance against the Israelis. Now, the reason that this really is something that Trump would take to heart is that he sees kind of the gem of his foreign policy, especially from his last term, as the Abraham Accords, right? This agreement between Israel and these four other of the Arab majority countries pictured here, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and to some extent Sudan, who all to varying degrees agreed to recognize Israel, normalize relations with Israel, etc. If all of a sudden the Israelis are striking the Qataris, the Emiratis or the Bahrainis are talking about, maybe we can't remain part of these deals, or it doesn't get expanded to the Saudis, which is something that Trump really wants. This is something that threatens, Trump's kind of key policy or foreign policy achievement in the region. It's one of the other reasons that he wants to pressure the Israelis and Netanyahu not to do things like this, which threaten, again, one of the key interests that he has. Okay. Couple just final small points. I mentioned Egypt. It's important to note that Egypt, again, remains a U.S. ally, quote unquote, a country that gets $1 billion a year, at least in aid from the U.S. for its peace deal with the Israelis. But Egypt increasingly is buying weapons from China. They carry out their first joint military operation, pictured here. And a lot of that comes from the fact that, again, the U.S. is committed to a qualitative advantage for Israel vis-a-vis any other state in the region. So even though Egypt is a U.S. ally, they don't get sold the same quality stuff that the Israelis do. The Egyptians say, hey, China has increasingly high-quality military as well as economic investment, etc. So they've grown a bit closer to the Chinese, which is something to watch as a broader trend in the region. And then finally, some of you may have seen some developments in Syria. This is a fascinating picture of President Trump shaking hands with the new leader of Syria, someone who previously was an individual who was part of a jihadi organization that the U.S. was somewhat fighting against and even hunting. You may have seen that General Petraeus was having an on-stage interview with him, which again is a fascinating dynamic because they were previously, enemies who were fighting each other. But interestingly, Trump signed an order lifting U.S. sanctions on Syria that had been put there for the Assad administration and kept there. So, again, to some extent, with Saudi urging, trying to have greater stability or support in Syria. Some suggest this could be part of a push to try to get Syria to normalize with the Israelis. We'll see. But long and short, there's also extensive domestic unrest in Syria as this government tries to consolidate its power, but simultaneously is launching varying degrees of attacks, either against the Alawis in the west or down against the Druze in the south. So Syria, even though you might think, oh, the Assad regime's been toppled, the civil war is over, there's still a lot, unfortunately, violence and things to be said and done there. Okay, so to conclude, things to watch before the next session in October that I hope you'll join me and us again for. So we saw the Trump-Netanyahu meeting. What's the outcome of that? How is this deal going to potentially be adjusted now that Hamas has its hands on the deal as well? Are they going to protest or try to change things? So that's point one. What ultimately will be the final plan for the day after in Gaza? We want to keep eyes on that. Thirdly, we haven't talked as much about this, but it's something I will talk about in the next session, the actual voices of the Gazans, right? This is not just something where it is or should be decided by, Trump and Netanyahu or Hamas or otherwise, right? The people on the ground who are suffering need to be heard from as well, and they will be heard from as well. And so how they will vote with their voices, with their ballots, if there's elections, with their feet or otherwise, that's an important thing to consider and to watch for. Fourthly, there's been this wave of recognitions by Europe and Australia and Canada and others of a Palestinian state. Is that going to be something that's just a recognition, or is there going to actually be real bite behind it in terms of cutting of arms sales and trade with the Israelis, in terms of doing things regarding diplomatic or international legal challenges to the Israelis in the West Bank or otherwise? This is something to watch for. And then finally, if a ceasefire is agreed to, will Arab-Israeli normalization be back on the table? Will there be more discussions now of, the Saudis will join the Abraham Accords or other states? Doesn't seem very likely at all that they'll do that while this conflict is ongoing in Gaza. But if and when it ends, it's a possibility. So something to keep an eye out for. I want to reiterate, as much as you're reading American news sources, some of which are good quality on the region, you can't beat also triangulating what you're reading from Middle East sources like an Al Monitor and Al Jazeera, Israeli news sources, whether it's IDI, which does great pollings of Israelis, or Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, etc., or on the Palestinian side, PCPSR does great polling of Palestinians, as well as other Palestinian news sources. Again, these are all in English, so you don't have to speak Arabic or Hebrew to read these. It will really push you to be exposed to stories you haven't seen before and or hear angles and perspectives you haven't seen before. And trust me, some of them will make you angry, some of them you won't agree with, but this is how you get a more holistic understanding of the region and its peoples, and you'll come much more informed to future sessions. So please, I hope to see you on October 27th, as well as the other dates here. You can register on the MIT Middle East North Africa website or using these QR codes. And I just want to thank you again for watching today and being with me. I do my best to cover a lot of information in a clear but sometimes short time because I know you're all very busy. So I hope you found this informative. I hope you like the different perspectives I presented, even if you don't agree with all of them. And I look forward to engaging with you live in future sessions and answering your questions. So thank you so much.